Asheville, North Carolina did something that, if I am being bluntly honest with you, I never thought I would see this century. Um, they, city, apologized for its part in slavery, and on top of the apology, has passed some level of a resolution for reparations. Um, I'm not getting choked up. My mouth is dry. They passed a resolution for reparations. That's astonishing. Now, right off the bat, my first thought is it is difficult to do that on a local level because if you're imparting any kind of increase in your revenue, you somehow have to pay for that revenue in other ways. It's easier to do that from the level of a federal government because they don't have to pay for that directly or immediately in the moment. So that's the first point. The second point, though, kudos for being willing to do it, for being willing to take that step. Shockingly, acid didn't fall from the sky and eradicate them from the map. They're still there. They're still kicking around. Everybody is still okay. Now, what they're calling reparations is basically going to be programs to try to instantiate more wealth into the community itself. There's a debt ratio between whites and blacks, or a ratio, a monetary gap that's like 176,000 to 18,000. And when you go into areas like with a bachelor degree, without, those numbers get horrific. So clearly there's something, some vestige there that extends all the way back then to now, especially when the advantages coming out of slavery from the standpoint of being of a particular color and of a particular class were instantiated into America through law. So the moment that one person gets an advantage from the standpoint, let's say, of race, even if the person is not rich, the job opportunities of their kids, the environment to which their kids live in, all of those things become somewhat different, even their association or engagement with the law enforcement. Their jobs are not going to be blocked from them because at the end of the day, they're still white. The opportunities are going to be available to them. Nobody's making the argument that anybody living today is guilty. All of this stuff is random. I could have been born as a white person. Somebody else that was white could have been born to him. It's quirks. We don't necessarily know that as a flat fact from a larger incorporeal level, but from a corporeal level, that's all we got. And so these questions are not necessarily done in order to attack any particular race, even though I can imagine it feels that way if you are of the race that we're talking about. And there may be an aversion to having that type of honest conversation in regards to guilt, or let's say unresolved guilt. Now, the legislation that these guys are passing, kudos. I mean, just honestly. Look, we have an issue in this country that often just goes unresolved. And the can is kicked down the road, and you have this greatly disadvantaged community that year after year after year, you don't see a change from the standpoint of the wealth gap, meaning you have this permanent underclass. They just had an article out that said nobody who's making a minimum wage could afford any place to live in the United States. That's like a 2-bedroom home, or for that matter, even a 1-bedroom. You would have had to make, let's say, like 20-some thousand. Well, you have nearly half of the country only making $42,000 a year. So where do people live under those conditions when you don't necessarily have the means in order to live in a safe neighborhood? Like, this is kind of what I mean when I'm getting to when I make this point of some of the things that people dealing with today, just through quirks of their birth, have gone back centuries. And in going back for those centuries, and in those quirks of birth, everything that has taken place for them is not entirely within the context of their control, because they're not given necessarily the same opportunities that others have. So imagine for the moment if that kid gets some kind of brain deformity from poverty. That's not within that kid's power. That's kind of the point that I'm getting at. There's certain things that come along with certain conditions that we have people growing up in. And those things are entirely related often to environment. Now, this city, Asheville, is trying to ameliorate some of that. And they're trying to instill that in the context of wealth, meaning not sending a check, but somehow imparting wealth to that particular community in a way that it could be lasting and it could build. I was enamored by this. I'll just read it. In an extraordinary move, the Ashville City Council has apologized for North Carolina City's historic role in slavery, discrimination, and denial of basic liberties to black residents and voted to provide reparations to them and their descendants. The 7-0 vote came at night on July 14th. Hundreds of years of black blood spill that basically fills the cup we drink from today, says Councilman Keith Young, one of the two African American members of the body and the measure's chief proponent. It is simply not enough to remove statues. Black people in this country are dealing with issues that are systemic in nature. The unanimously passed resolution does not mandate direct checks. Instead, it makes investment into where black residents face disparities. The resulting budgetary and programmatic priorities may include, but not limited to, increasing minority home ownership and access to affordable housing, increasing minority business ownership and career opportunities, strategies to grow equity and generational wealth, closing gaps in healthcare, education, employment, and pay, neighborhood safety and fairness with criminal justice. The resolution reads. Keep an eye on Ashville to see how this turned out and to see if there are any substantial changes to the numbers in regards to the averages from Asheville in comparison to the other cities in the other states. Meaning Asheville is going to be almost a test case to see whether or not this particular plan works. And if it's something that works, it's something that may be replicated in other cities across the United States, putting pressure on the federal government at some point to recognize it and do something similar. So this is phenomenal. Think back to Canada for the moment. Canada didn't get health care immediately from the federal government. Canada got health care because areas in Canada started to provide it, and they realized this was the most efficacious or the most efficient way of dealing with that particular issue. Well, this may be something similar, where the rationale becomes, let's settle this issue and let's get past this. And if this becomes a success story, then you may have other people following along with it. So all due diligence and all just applause to Nashville for this. That's pretty amazing. I'll end it here. Like, share, and subscribe. And by the way, it's not cash payments, no. But I'm not necessarily against a test case to see how it turns out. My issue is this. If you give money, the question becomes, how much do you give? And let's say you say, okay, I'm going to give $325,000 to each person. Well, Nashville can't afford that. The federal government could afford that. Nashville can't. Also, if you give people these kind of smaller payments, is that something that the person is going to be able to create generational wealth from, or is that something that's going to be spent almost immediately? It's probably going to be spent almost immediately. So they are trying to find a way of providing deeper and systemic changes into the way that wealth is accrued, and to have that to be diverted in a way to African Americans. Now, one of these schemes, affirmative action, ended up with more white women using the program than actual African Americans. And so hopefully this is done specific to African Americans, and this one is a little bit more targeted to trying to hold that gap or close that gap. One more point. I would be curious to see how the white population reacts to this. My argument has always been that whites don't regard their history honestly, because if you do regard their history honestly, reparations almost just comes in line with, well, of course that's right, because yes, we stole free labor in order to get this country up and running. After we stole free labor to get this country up and running, we blocked you out of certain jobs. We castigated you and your look. The very thought of blackness in and of itself was given certain tint associated with it in our culture and society. We mangled you into a slave, and then even after that, your image was used on television and in various dramas, whatnot, only in certain positions in order to keep a certain idea in your head so you can have an idea of a place in the society. You have certain positions that are just not even available to African Americans, or for that matter, even living situations. Meaning, going all the way up until like the 80s or the 90s, a situation was created that was just basically hostile to progress en masse. And then all of a sudden, there's somewhat of a shift change where more opportunities are allowed And then you have other people basically arguing, well, all right, pull yourself by your bootstraps and keep it moving. Now, I don't doubt that some people are better than others in regards to working their way within our particular system. But I think it's farcical to make the case that that debt that was accrued all of those years by the U.S. government through the laws that it had passed should not be paid. And we should just give that a look as if it didn't exist, when we can actually see statistically in numbers the effects on the various communities in this country. I'll be curious to see how whites respond to this. But kudos to Ashville. Keep an eye on it. Like, share,